I want to thank everybody for coming to the last MDIBL Lab Science Cafe of the season. We got a great turnout. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Aric Rogers, who's our newest scientist at the laboratory, just started in February. Aric's had an interesting career path. He started out training as a meteorologist at Penn State University, actually studied climate change in Antarctica, and apparently at some point in this period of time when he was studying weather, he saw a program on the genetics of aging and how our genetics can influence how we age, how well we age, how long our health span is. And he got very intrigued by that and decided to go and get a PhD in cellular and molecular biology at University of Massachusetts, then spent several years at the Buck Institute for Research on Aging out in California before he joined MDIBL Lab in February, correct? February. And Aric's actually had some very prestigious awards. He came to the lab with a very prestigious NIH Pathways to Independence grant. And just a couple of months ago, he was awarded a new investigator in aging from the Ellison Foundation, which is the first for the biolab because we weren't even eligible for that grant a year ago. But they learned of the program we were creating, and Aric applied for it and actually received that grant. So it's a very prestigious award. So tonight what he's going to talk about is the genetics of aging and whether or not we are getting close to being able to improve our longevity and our health span by looking at our genetics and how we might treat those.
That was such a great introduction, I don't need to introduce myself. I'll just start by saying that there have been some really amazing, relatively recent developments in our understanding of the connection between genetics and aging. And the science now suggests that these are going to have some very important implications for human health span and lifespan. So, right now, here we go. If you ask somebody if they're interested in having their lifespan increased, most of us might think that they would say yes, until somebody very close to me, I won't say who they are, I'll give them a fake name, we'll say his name is Mark, said, I don't want my lifespan increased. And knowing this person as I do, I knew it didn't have to do with their religious beliefs. I knew it wasn't some bigger socioeconomic concern about what was implied with that. So why would somebody think they don't want their lifespan to be increased outside of those issues? Anybody have an idea? Exactly. If you ask, say to someone in their early 20s, I have a magic pill to give you, and it's going to allow you to live to 80 as though you only lived into your mid-50s with all the health benefits and appearance and all of that with it, they'd say, hey, that's great. If you told somebody, I can give you a guaranteed extra 20 years of life, but it's going to be in an iron lung, they might give them some pause. So when aging researchers, and I am an aging researcher, studying experiencing that firsthand, when we talk about things, when we do research and we look at things that extend lifespan of our lab animals, our animal models, one of the things, and I want to really emphasize this today, that we see along with increased lifespan is an increase in health span. Essentially, almost every method, whether it's genetic manipulation or an environmental regime that we create that increases lifespan, actually seems to slow aging, in as much as animals look healthier, they are healthier, they move more compared to their control counterparts. So we are really talking about, when aging research, we're looking in the context of both lifespan and health span. So with that said, the topics that I'd like to touch on today, right now, how is aging treated medically? What's the influence of environment and genetics on how we age? What have our animal models taught us about this process? Are there methods or drugs available for humans right now that would slow the aging process? And what does the future hold, immediate and long term? How is aging treated medically? Right now, most aging is treated as the age-related disease occurs. Things like cancer, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, neurological conditions, immune dysfunction, muscle wasting. Some of these things we have pretty good treatments for. Others we have absolutely nothing for right now. So right now our strategy is, for the most part, to treat something as it occurs, which is appropriate. Of course, if you come down with something, you want there to be a treatment available to you. For a few things, we have some preventative care available. If your doctor diagnoses you with high blood pressure early on, might put you on some drugs to bring that under control and reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease down the line. Unfortunately, for the most part, with any of these treatments, and even the preventative ones, they're non-transferable. We can't take one treatment, say radiation therapy for certain kinds of cancer. It's been around for 100 years. And it's been around that long because for some things it works very well. There's a lot of collateral damage. And we can't take radiation therapy and apply it for the treatment of heart disease or neurodegeneration or immune dysfunction. It'd probably have a very bad effect in those regards. So what if there was something that we could add to our arsenal to combat age-related disease and decline that accounted for most, if not all, of these things? Right now there is nothing like that, except there is one magic bullet that we have in our arsenal, and that is lifestyle. And this is it's available to everybody. It's common sense stuff. Not everybody takes advantage of it. Sometimes it's hard to live without our little sins in life. But you know, it is there. But we don't have a medical intervention. We don't have something that you can start taking at any point during adulthood to offset the effects of aging and age-related disease. So what influences aging? As I say, obviously lifestyle is important, and it's common sense stuff. Exercise, diet, you know, not too much alcohol, not too much tobacco, these kinds of common sense things that all of us have known about for a really long time. But then we all know some people who seem to maintain health and keep disease out of their lives, even in the absence of a perfect lifestyle. This is Winnie Langley here a few years ago, celebrating her 100th birthday by doing one of her favorite things. She's lighting up a cigarette. It's estimated to be her 170,000th cigarette of her lifetime. She started smoking at the outset in Great Britain of World War I to calm her nerves at the tender age of 7 years. 7 years old. Can you imagine having a kid that starts smoking when they're 7 to calm their nerves? Maybe it was needed during World War I. So there are some people who just seem, even in the absence of a perfect lifestyle, to avoid these things. That suggests either they're really, really lucky and they win the lottery multiple times with their health, or there's something to maybe a genetic predisposition to avoiding aging-related complications. So we have these examples in humans. What about what in the lab what has the laboratory environment taught us in model organisms? Well, we've known actually for a long time, and a lot of people might not know this, but for 100 years, there were some laboratory experiments that happened in the 1900s and the 1930s with rodents. I don't think they were looking for extended lifespan, but what they found is they just took and they restricted the overall diet of some of the mice in the lab to about 65% of what the other mice were doing. Lo and behold, they found that these mice were resistant to what usually kills lab mice, is cancer, and they lived 30% longer. And not only was their average lifespan and their median lifespan increased, but their maximum lifespan was increased. So in this country and a number of other developed nations, we've seen marvelous increases in average and median lifespan. Maximum lifespan, not so much. So this is really interesting that you can be under a certain regime and have a maximum increase, an increase in maximum lifespan. Back in the 70s and 80s, there were some breeding experiments with fruit flies, tiny Drosophila melanogaster here. What they did is they took a condition, and what they selected for is they said, we're going to take animals that reproduce later and later, are able to reproduce later and later in adulthood. And within 20 generations or so, they had animals with double the average lifespan. Now, if you know anything about evolution, that's not long enough for an evolutionary change. 20 generations, a handful of flies. So these are really impressive results. But up until now, it's still kind of a black box what exactly is going on. For lifespan increases by a diet, the idea was, well, it's sort of a rate of living idea. You burn your candle faster, the more calories you consume. It's a very appealing model because it kind of seems to make sense. But from a scientist's point of view, it's not really that appealing as far as a mechanistic reason why we see these things. For the breeding, even the scientists doing this at the time thought, well, we're just basically reshuffling the genes that they have in the population of flies we started with, and so the increase that we see is probably due to hundreds or thousands of different genes that have recombined in certain ways, variations in the genes to give these increases. So a remarkable result, but so far nothing that really says, that screams, aha, we can come up with a magic bullet, a pill, a treatment or something that's going to increase lifespan based on these results.
Sir,
Yes.
you said restricted the diet on the rodent. What did they do on the fly that were different than just breeding it for 20 generations?
It was selective breeding. So it was a artificial selection. They went in and they purposely took animals that could reproduce late. So only the animals that could reproduce, the 10% latest, those animals did they take and allow to go to the next generation. That was the only manipulation. No nutrient restriction, no dietary restriction. So the scientists from this study thought that there's really no single gene that we could attribute this to. There's no target that we could go after medically for something like this. So enter the revolution, something that happened within the last 20 years that completely changed the way that we think about how aging and lifespan and health span is regulated. And it started in the tiny nematode roundworm, C. elegans. This is the worm that we use in our lab for studying aging. And in this worm is shown here as an adult animal that's about 1/10 of a centimeter long. They're really tiny, less than 1,000 non-reproductive cells in the grown animal. So we have it very well characterized. They have muscle cells, they have neural cells, intestinal cells, just like we do, but simple. And what researchers found is that if they mutated one gene called DAF2, one gene, a remarkable thing happened. The lifespan of the organism doubled. A single gene mutation caused a doubling of lifespan. And not only did it double lifespan, but the animals remained healthier for longer. So you could look at these animals, and when the normal animals were dying, they were slowing down, They were obviously having a lot of difficulty that we would normally associate with aging in any species. These animals were vigorous, they looked good, you know, they're swimming across the plates, they're having a grand old time. They look, you can tell, they look healthy. They're also remarkably resistant to stress. Heat stress, radiation stress, poisons, toxins. So a really amazing result, and this was the first part of this revolution in how we thought of things. That a single gene, altering a single gene and its product, the protein that it encodes, could have such a dramatic result. Okay, now brace yourselves, you're going to get a 60-second science lesson. This protein is a hormone receptor. And in this animal, it's actually the only hormone receptor that is similar to, analogous to, our hormone receptors for things like insulin and growth factors. And so this helps the animal coordinate responses. When you have multiple different kinds of tissues, they have to be able to communicate. And so in the normal condition, if everything's working well, and the animal is, this hormone is, the receptor is working and it's receiving hormonal signals, it keeps this other factor, this other protein called FOXO here, out of the nucleus where our genetic material is. It keeps it out. If, however, you mutate this gene or put it under certain conditions that attenuates its ability to do its job of sensing and telling the cell to respond in certain ways, it allows this protein, called a transcription factor, to move into the nucleus and access new genetic programming. This is pre-existing genetic programming, it's not being accessed. Okay? So it goes in, it reprograms gene expression to double lifespan and do all of those other wonderful things. This is the second part of the explosion. Now, not only do we know that a single gene can be altered to have such a dramatic effect, but now we have some idea of how it works. When you have some idea of how something works, it really opens up your options for possibly going in and targeting it for potential therapeutic use. And I say therapeutic use because these genes have analogs in humans. FOXO is present. A few versions of FOXO are present in humans. So the revolutionary paradigm shift comes with another important observation. This has been done now in other organisms. And we see time and time again that anything you do that increases lifespan, an important correlate is generally you see accompanying increases in health span and frequently resistance to stress and a delaying or avoiding of age-related disease. So these are some of the model organisms that are commonly worked with. Everything from baker's yeast, shown here, the tiny fruit fly, Drosophila, C. elegans, and even in the mouse now, we have versions of this happening in many different kinds of genes in different what we would call longevity pathways. There's more than one that's been identified now. So now we have all of these potential targets, and the great thing is, well, we know we can't do these experiments in humans. A, it wouldn't be ethical, right? And B, it would take too damn long. So we rely on these guys. The good thing is, evolution likes to conserve important genes. And so all of these genes that lead to lifespan increases in these animal models that we look like are conserved in us. We have these same genes. How do we know if they're important for lifespan? Well, we can go and we can look at folks like Winnie Langley, centenarians, super centenarians, and we can, now we have the technology to go in and sequence their genomes and find out are there subtle differences in these genes that might be associated with longevity? And we do see that. We're seeing more and more evidence of that. So we have this evidence now. Folks like Winnie Langley, I don't actually know the sequence of her genome, but some of these folks that seem to be enjoying much longer, healthier lifespans than most of the rest of us, that there are some gene variations that correspond to those same aging-related genes in the animal models that we study. This gives us possible targets. The other thing, when we were talking about diet before with those mice, and how it was kind of, well, maybe it's just a rate of living, burning your candle faster or slower argument. We now have genetic models that show that there are genes responsible for those increases in lifespan and health span under dietary regimes. So without the proper function of some of those genes, we don't get those benefits. And the exciting implication of that is that potentially we could take a drug one day that would mimic the healthy lifestyle. It would be the healthy lifestyle drug. And then maybe if you add it to the healthy lifestyle, you get even greater results. So it really opens up, and it comes down to genetics, and why I'm really interested in genetics is that maybe we'll be able to target, if not the genes themselves, the biological processes that these genes regulate. So, this is where I open it up because I think some people have probably heard some things in the media or they've read something about maybe a possible anti-aging strategy, or that some compound over here increased the lifespan in a worm or in a mouse. What are some of the possible strategies? So we've already touched on dietary restriction. How does it work? Is it calories? Might be in certain instances, but it isn't in every. There are multiple different kinds of dietary restriction that increase lifespan. In a mouse, you can do it, seems, with calories. However, you can get the same lifespan increase, a 30% increase in lifespan, by literally restricting one amino acid. Not even all protein, one amino acid in the diet. You can give them. I can't, I'm just kidding. One of them that's been tested is methionine. And one of the reasons that this is likely to, a part of the reason for this may be that methionine is essential. It's not something that you make yourself. You can recycle it, but you can't manufacture it. Right? So you have to get it from your diet. The other thing is that this amino acid is at the beginning of every protein that's made in your body. So it initiates the process of protein synthesis for every protein. It acts as a control for this process.
And when I go to the supermarket, where will the shelf?
Well, you would have to somehow subtract it from your diet and not add it to your diet for the effect.
Where will be on the shelf? So I will.
It's in everything, but it's in everything at different degrees. Obviously, we get a lot more of our amino acids and diversity of amino acids from meat than anywhere else. So some people, for various reasons, might go on a low protein diet. Obviously we have examples of high protein diet, things like the Atkins diet, but it's also comes with low carb. So there you're taking a form of dietary restriction that's not necessarily, doesn't have necessarily anything to do with calories. It has to do with macronutrients, fats, proteins, carbohydrates. Hormesis. What the hell is hormesis? Anybody have ideas? So this is the idea that maybe a little bit of the poison actually makes you healthier and stronger. Little dose, poison now and then. Maybe that glass of wine. Not 10 glasses of wine. Maybe a glass of wine. In worms, okay, we can take the little worms that I'm working with. You can put them at a temperature that if you leave them there, it'll kill them. Close to our body temperature, it will kill them. But if you do it for a short time, you take them out so that they have a chance to recover, those animals from one heat shock, one time, will live longer than their counterparts. Exposing to certain toxins, certain things that we would consider bad at certain concentrations. And that's the trick. What is the right concentration? Some people handling snakes inject themselves with venom, very tiny amounts of venom, to basically build up a resistance if they actually get bit by the real thing. There's anecdotal evidence that that might actually impart some health benefits. How many people in here have ever gone to a sauna or a steam room or a hot tub? It feels good, right? But it's also uncomfortable. And if you stayed in there, you'd die. But a lot of people swear by it, that it makes them feel better. Maybe it releases endorphins. It's a little uncomfortable. The whole heat shock idea in cold-blooded animals seems to work really well for lifespan. We know less about what it does in warm-blooded animals. But one thing that we know it does is it activates certain stress response programs. And the really cool thing about all of this is that all these programs, these genetic programs, not every program you have in your genes is running at all times. It's which ones you access at which times. And so what's neat is everything we're finding, it's already there. It's already in the organism. It just needs to be tapped. And so extending lifespan and healthspan becomes not so much a matter of, injecting something brand new into us to function in some new and hitherto unknown way, but it's basically just doing some programming. Okay, pull up the health span enhancing and stress resistance program, please. And there's evidence that we do that somewhat with our diets and with our lifestyle. With these dietary restriction regimes, what's the problem with restricting diet? Well, in adults, as long as you are not causing malnutrition, it's not a bad thing. Now, some people have taken it to an extreme, and they're on these severe dietary restriction regimes. And if it's caloric-based, they're cold all the time and they have no sex drive. So that's a drawback. But they're trying to access this. They're trying to test this. The other thing is that the foods you eat do change your genetic programs. They change the ones that are running at the time. So if we do something like a dietary restriction or protein restriction, is that going to necessarily be a good idea in a child?
No.
They're growing. Okay? So it's really important that those growth pathways stay active within reason. We seem to have a little overgrowth problem in this country right now, and getting the right nutrients in the right amount. But obviously you wouldn't want to restrict a growing individual from getting the nutrients that they need. But once you're full grown, it can be a little bit of a different story. And so if you keep eating like you're still growing, well, you're kind of telling your body, keep going, keep growing, but you're done growing. And so one of the patterns that we've seen, and I'll just use this term once, called antagonistic pleiotropy. And all it means is that some of those genes that were really important for growth early on tend to hasten age-related decline after we become adults. So one of the strategies, one of the ways that we look for new genes is we we're looking at those ones that are important for growth. And we say, okay, now if we attenuate those, if we reduce their function in an adult animal, what happens? And frequently it leads to a lifespan increase. If we do it in a developing organism, in a child, well, they stop growing and they die. So it's very context dependent when and where these sorts of things are done. Yeah, question?
I'm still back on an earlier part of your talk. What is it in the natural lifespan of the C. elegans that prevents the FOXO from getting, I mean, why does that DAF2 or what prevent the FOXO from getting into the nucleus? What is the reason, evolution, what is the, benefit?
That's an excellent question. So obviously I presented this thing, I said, here's a gene, and you basically do something to screw it up a little bit, not remove it completely, but screw it up so it can't do its job as well. And there's all these amazing health benefits. Well, why didn't nature just select that version of it to begin with? Why was there an alternative? And it goes right back to what I was just talking about, this idea of what's important for growth early on can sometimes hasten age-related decline later. So those animals, if you take one worm, these are self-fertilizing animals, by the way. So if I take a normal one and I take a mutant and I put them on a plate together and I let Darwinian survival of the fittest take over under good conditions, guess who wins? No. The normal one wins because he grows up faster. Okay, it's able to reproduce more quickly. So the other one just gets diluted out. Plus the other one, if conditions get slightly too crowded or slightly too warm, it turns on this stress response pathway during growth that arrests its development. So now it's going to get even further outcompeted. It gets a little stressed out when it's growing, and it says, oh, stop growing, conditions aren't good. And the normal animal will do that too, but it takes a lot higher threshold to reach that. So from a purely Darwinian survival of the fittest, under good conditions, wild type wins out, and that mutant goes away, unless you maintain it in the lab. Now, there are certain conditions where it would be beneficial to have that mutation. But by and large, for the most part, that does not help you. And evolution cares about what maximizes your fitness in the regime and the niche that you inhabit. That's what evolution cares about, not what helps you live longer, healthier. If you think about it, what does evolution care about? You need to reproduce. For humans, you have to live long enough to raise your offspring. So what's to select for survival?
Well, it sort of becomes an engineering question.
Karen?
Yes, has our discovery of the DOC2 gene contributed to better understanding genetic diseases? I think it's called progeria, where you develop, you age, in your first few months of life, or certain kinds of dwarfism that have to do with growth hormones.
Yes. So yeah, there are these genetic conditions that sort of mimic certain aspects of accelerated aging, but they're not perfect. They're not all aspects of accelerated aging. In other words, somebody with progeroid syndrome doesn't actually grow up faster and reproduce faster and then die faster. They actually begin aging before they even grow up, or they start showing these signs. But we have seen certain analogous situations in humans to that DAF2 mutation. Okay? One of them is called Laron syndrome, and it affects a group of folks in Ecuador. And this is it's an allele, or it's a variation of a growth hormone receptor. And these people grow to about 4 feet tall. They are remarkably resistant to the development. They don't develop cancer, they don't get type 2 diabetes. There's an obvious drawback. Okay, they grow to 4 feet. That obviously causes some stress, and the stress causes probably a very high incidence. There's a very high incidence of reported alcoholism and accidents, and it's one of the reasons they think they don't have the numbers to see extended lifespan. And so there's some drawbacks, and that's the kind of thing when you have a mutation in a gene that's permanent. That goes from one generation to the next. If you go and you attenuate that growth hormone receptor during adulthood, you might have a very different outcome because now you're already grown. Everything has had time to develop as it should.
When you're talking about stress, are you differentiating between developmental biological stress or social stress?
I haven't. I didn't. Most of the examples I gave are environmental, but certainly emotional stress is a form of stress. I mean, we actually release stress hormones, in response to not just physical stress, but emotional stress. So our neural circuitry that senses environmental changes also responds to our perceived environmental changes in a very similar way, and so it can have similar consequences. If somebody's under chronic stress, just like under chronic heat stress, that's not a good thing. It's maybe a very temporary short-term stress, who knows, might be.
Are there any clues as to what the function of these longevity genes might be? If not, any speculation?
A lot of the longevity genes are related to if reducing their function extends lifespan, they tend to be important for growth. If increasing their function increases lifespan, they tend to have to do with responding to various forms of stress. So we actually do know a lot about some of the genes that are under investigation as being aging related, as having other functions. And that's how we came up with that idea for the fancy word that I use, phrase that I use, antagonistic pleiotropy, is that there seems to be this trade-off in nature between growth and being able to respond to stress. And this is what I mean when I say we have we got a lot of DNA, and there's a lot of programs running in that DNA, but they're not all running at the same time in every cell in your body. They're running because that cell is a liver cell and it's supposed to have that function. That cell is a neural cell and it's supposed to have that function. Same DNA, different genetic programs running.
The reverse would be going back to sort of this totipotency. I'm thinking of, instead of aging, going back to the sort of germ cell stage where maybe certain drugs or something could have more potency for relieving certain diseases. Or is that a dead end? Or silly? Or no?
Are you touching on an idea of like regeneration?
Not necessarily, but being able to have a different effect on cells because they are not predetermined as to their function.
Okay, so your stem cells.
Yeah, for example, or
Stem cells. So, and then in what context? So, like,
well,
you would want to maintain those in a.
well, maybe drug delivery for people who have, certain. You had a list of the cancers and type 2
Right.
diabetes and the neurological stuff.
So yeah, I mean, for some of those conditions, if the condition is because a tissue has gone haywire or is malfunctioning, then you would definitely want something that could correct that. And you could correct it either within the cell itself, potentially, or you could replace it.
Yeah, regeneration.
You could you replace it with regeneration. So this sort of comes to an idea that's one of the reasons that I'm very interested in the biolab where I am now is that a lot of the emphasis is on regeneration and our ability to regenerate. And regeneration and some of the anti-aging strategies that I've been looking at could possibly be two separate but complementary things. So it's an area that's really interesting, because in these animal C. elegans, okay, there's no stem cells except for their reproductive cells. There's no stem cells to replace a lost muscle cell, a lost neural cell, and yet through genetic manipulation, we've been able to increase the lifespan of these things tenfold. So very different thing. I think that's going to be one of the keys to regeneration, actually anti-aging, not just slowing aging, but anti-aging will be employing both strategies, our strategy of reducing the rate of aging and regeneration. Is there another question? So I'll tell you a little bit about, yes?
I've become aware of certain doctors who have programs for weight control, and they use dietary restriction plus exercise plus something called growth hormone that they're giving to adults. Do you know anything about this and what research has been done on that?
So yeah, hormone replacement, especially for adults, is something that some doctors are doing. I think we don't yet know. I'm not a medical doctor, okay? Say that right now. I think the verdict is out exactly on. I mean, there are certain instances in which you definitely want those. I'll give an example that's near and dear to my heart. My grandfather, when he was in his last years of life, he had dealt with cancer and just terrible muscle wasting and lack of energy, and so we were in the process. He was in the process of moving, and the doctor put him on a steroid. It was remarkable. It was like it was anti-aging, you know. It was a really remarkable, profound effect. This man who was, and the same thing for my grandmother. You know, she got to a point where she was almost completely laid out all the time, and then they gave her some steroids, and she was up running around without a walker or anything. It was remarkable. The problem is that some of these things are sort of temporary. They may actually hasten this whole idea of age-related decline. So I'm not sure, like the dietary restriction, mixed with dietary restriction, mixed with exercise, what is the net impact of that? Because obviously the growth hormone is probably going to make you feel better, and it'll probably give you more energy. So in the context of those other improvements, is it a net gain? Might be. Don't know. But yeah, I've definitely heard about that sort of thing. So there are some very interesting drugs right now that are sort of on the horizon. People are looking really closely at them as, is this something that we're going to make available in the not too distant future for use to ameliorate some of the age-related decline in humans. The first one I have up here is rapamycin. This was something that was found, I think it was found from a fungus on Easter Island. It's an antibiotic, but it's also used, it's already approved for use in humans as an anti-rejection drug. So you get a tissue transplant, an organ transplant, and this is something that helps keep the body from rejecting somebody else's organ. So that makes it exciting right there, because now all of the testing has been done, toxicity testing, clinical trials in humans, for the particular purpose of as an anti-rejection drug. This has been shown in multiple animal species to increase lifespan. It has now been shown in mice to increase lifespan. And this is the big hurdle. It's getting something to work in mice, and not just getting it to work in mice, but getting it to work in the next lab in mice. Repeatability. And this has passed the test. It has now been repeated. They're still working out some of the details for optimization, and there's some concern about blood glucose levels with it, but it does increase lifespan in outbred mouse strains in a couple of different labs now. So that makes it very interesting and very compelling to study further. In fact, so many people are interested in this, they started making tons of rapalogs. Rapamycin sort of analog chemicals look similar, might function similarly, might have like a little bit more potency to them. So it's generated a lot of interest, and this is something that is actually being studied by Dave Harris's group up the road at the Jackson Labs here on the island. So a lot of interest, a lot of potential. Metformin, this is another drug that's been approved for use in humans. This one is for people with type 2 diabetes. And so it's going to help control body's blood glucose levels. Metformin has been shown in a number of animal species, including mice. It's not quite as far along as rapamycin in those. Resveratrol in your red wine. Okay, have people heard about resveratrol? You can go and buy resveratrol. Right? It's not a drug as such. It's an herbal. You can go and get it. It has been shown in a few species to increase lifespan. There has been a lot of controversy over the mechanism and some of the early associated with it and some of the early results. The issue is bioavailability. Does it make it efficiently into your bloodstream? There have been people working on analogs of this, more potent. Some of the studies for the effect of it or compounds like it, or the genetic models of how it works, suggest in mice that it could ameliorate effects of like a high-fat diet, obesity, that sort of thing. It has yet to be shown to actually extend lifespan, it or the different models that they have for how it works. But now so much effort is going into, because they have some idea of how these things might work with those longevity genes and the proteins that they encode that I've talked about, that this is a major area, because, think of the implication that if you could delay by, 10 years, 20 years, the onset of a number of these diseases across the board. We're not just talking about hypertension, leading to cardiovascular disease. We're talking about many different aging-related maladies. Has anybody heard of any other ones you want to discuss?
I had a question.
Yes.
Is anybody studying coenzyme Q10?
Lots of people are studying.
Does it have any effect on?
I believe it has been shown to have some effect, although I'm not sure what the effect has been in worms. There's some issue, seems like there was some issue with bioavailability, but yeah, there have been a lot of human studies and tissue culture studies with cells in the petri dish. But yeah, that one has a ways to go. Yes?
Yeah, you asked for other drugs. I think there's a company that was playing with something called Sirtuins. It
Yes.
affects the SIR2 gene.
Yep.
And they found that after a lot of investors put tons of money in, it didn't have much of an effect.
Yeah. Well, so that's the one where I said there's a little bit of controversy. That was from resveratrol was found to be an activator of sirtuins. So that whole sirtuin story had a lot of buildup, and there was a lot of initial interest, but there were some issues along the way with interpretation of some results, and so far it looks like some of the targets that they've been looking at might not extend lifespans in mammals, but might actually make people more resistant to certain aging-related diseases. So the jury is still kind of out.
I have a question about rapamycin.
Yes.
I believe that part of that way it works, it depresses the immune system. So if you have to give enough of rapamycin to extend lifespan, does that mean you're more sensitive to infections and other things, so that there's an offset in that benefit.
Yeah. Obviously, people who go on, who receive a kidney or something from a donor, they go on these drugs, that is one of the caveats, right? That they might make them more susceptible. It doesn't mean they can't fight infection. That would kill you really quick. It means that it does suppress it to some extent. So is that an acceptable trade-off is the question. Or could you cycle it? 6 weeks on, 2 weeks off, something like that, to allow the immune system time. Immune system, there's a lot of proliferation, a lot of growth. So it makes sense. Here's something that's kind of anti that. Anti-proliferation, anti-growth.
What about low-dose aspirin?
That's a very popular one. That, I mean, obviously it's already been shown in humans to you know, for aging-related disease to be a big deal. So I think something like that has the potential to be considered in that group of I don't know how much it's going to affect some of the other aging-related diseases. So certainly some of them. All of them? Is it anti-aging, or is it just taking care of a pathway that affects maybe several of them? But it's definitely in there as a big one, because hey, some people have been taking half an aspirin for 20 years, you know. My dad does. Yeah.
Is anybody looking at the social implications of longer life?
Well, and that's kind of what I touched on in the beginning. I mean, what if people stop running out of money? You know, what if they are perceived to become a burden on their family? These are the socioeconomic concerns, right? Yeah. Not my, no. I obviously I'm a believer. I'm a believer that I would rather help, and maybe we can resolve these issues together. The other thing is, if you have a healthier population, maybe some people decide, not to retire, to work longer, or contribute in other ways, be teachers, help us. It seems like there's a lack of wisdom these days in our federal government, and maybe having healthier minds and healthier older people with the wisdom to know would be a good thing. I don't know. But yes, definitely it is a concern, it's an issue.
Is there anything that you personally have done to change what you're like according to things that you've learned?
So, yeah, that's, I definitely have my wine. It's something that it has caused me. I've started feeling the effects. I've put on, during my postdoc, I probably put on 50 pounds. Okay, yeah, I was thin my whole life, but I was bad. I wasn't doing all the right things. I've actually started to reverse that a little bit since I've come here. I have lost 15 pounds. Wow. Slowly but surely. Try to, do a little better with the diet, go for a 3-mile walk at least 4 times a week, I've got a beautiful area to do it. I work on this island. So, yes, it's definitely, some of those things, the lifestyle changes I have done. Supplements, I used to take, before I became an aging researcher, I thought, I don't know why everyone just doesn't take supplements. We should all be taking lots of supplements. I've heard wonderful things about some of the supplements and the studies that have been done. And then I got into aging research and I said, you know what? I'll opt more for trying to get some things in the diet, and I need to rethink and retool what is the right supplement for me to take. So there are some I've been toying with just adding. I mean, most of these things are dietary. I mean, things like probably you've heard about curcumin or something like that. Turmeric. That has potential benefits. What's that? There you go. So there are some things that I think you could do that have pretty low risk, but the verdict is still out exactly. What the bioavailability of some things are, exactly how they're working. If we see that they work in tissue culture and cells in a petri dish, are they going to work in the live organism? I have a friend who looked a lot at curcumin, and he had shown, he got a Nature paper out of it, how it could extend lifespan in a model organism, and he had a novel mechanism for how it was working to do that. then there's been a lot of interest in it, and people have been doing it in clinical trials for humans, for neurological disorders and this sort of thing. And the evidence kind of, it's still, the verdict is still out. So we still have a ways to go to understand a lot of these things.
So is there a good model for aging? You say mice is sort of a gold standard, but they're pretty far from human. In a lot of other areas of research, mice are terrible models.
Well, yeah, there's been a lot of press about that, about how, well, you can't, you know, oh, this is not the best model for studying this particular disease. Recently, I've heard a lot, I've seen a lot about that. The fact of the matter is that evolution conserves a lot more than it gets rid of. And although we are different because we live in different niches, the essential biological processes that are important for life also seem to be important for aging. And so I think there are a lot of great models for aging. I think we've learned a lot from baker's yeast. You know, and they're not even multicellular, they don't even have hormones. But for metabolism and that sort of thing and other processes that are localized within the cell, they've taught us a lot. And one thing we're able to do by using multiple organisms, we can say, oh, we found a mechanism over here. Is it going to work in this system? Is it going to work in this system? Is it going to work in this system? Because it works in all those diverse systems. There's a better chance that it might work in us. So I think, you know, a ton of work has been done in C. elegans, and there's so many wonderful tools. I love C. elegans. I think mice are good. Mice are always going to be necessary because on the evolutionary tree, they're a mammal. They're a lot closer to humans than the invertebrates. So, okay, this is a little science fiction. This is a science fiction, but it's science fiction is a prelude to science fact. We all know, right? So in the immediate future, we're definitely looking for a better idea of molecular targets in humans, and that's not so much science fiction. That's the right now. People are looking at things like nanotechnology to go in and sort of feng shui the cell, sort of do the job that stress, related proteins and stuff are supposed to do. Maybe you just program a machine to go in and clean the system up. Some people are into cryopreservation, and although there's a lot of problems with it, like right now we can't resuscitate anyone from cryopreservation. And so we have very little hope of doing that for somebody who has died. The thing is that those folks are relying on something like nanotechnology to go in and fix the damage of freezing someday. They have 100 years, as long as nobody thaws them out before that. But they have a hell of a lot better chance than the rest of us that go into the ground. Because there's very little chance any of us are coming back from that. Reversal of aging. I think this is a big one, and I believe this is going to be an important fusion of regeneration technology. This is my own point of view here. I'm not spouting somebody else's point of view. This is mine. It's going to be a fusion of regeneration and anti-aging. Because right now, they're not exactly the same thing. Some of the animals that we have that have amazing abilities, or let's say better abilities than us to regenerate, they don't live forever. So there's got to be more than one thing going on, and finding where, exactly how those two things interact. I think that's where actual reversal of aging, is at some point will become possible. And then, of course, there's downloading consciousness. Even if you live forever, you can be in a car accident, and if you have a system crash, literally a crash, downloading consciousness. Some people are actually looking into that. It's science fiction right now, but again, who knows? It's down the road. Anything else?
Yes, research being done on how hypnosis affects you physically, genetically.
I don't know a lot about hypnosis, but what I do know is that that's going to definitely be something that is through neural circuitry. And let me just tell you a little quick story about how important neural circuitry is in our perception of things. So in flies, it's not calories that leads to lifespan extension or decrease, it's protein. It's really important for their life cycle to get protein at a certain point to reproduce. Their protein source is yeast. And so if they if you restrict the yeast from their diet, they live longer, and they live substantially longer. If you expose them to the smell of yeast, so they believe they're in its presence even if they can't eat it, they can't get it as a protein source, you lose 1/3 of that lifespan benefit. So definitely the way our brains interact with our environment is, and especially in humans, you know that's got to be amplified many times more.
One more question?
One more question?
You're it.
Are there any animals that don't age?
That don't age? So there are some animals that we don't know what the maximum lifespan is, and so like there are things that basically have lots and lots and lots of potential to regenerate. They're on a very extreme, tend to be on a very extreme end. Things like jellyfish or planaria. So these are going to be interesting models. They're not fully developed yet, but they are of great interest because they can do some miraculous things, and we don't know what the full potential for aging is. Okay. Thank you very much.